Look at this meme. These 4 maps are everywhere. Twitter threads, campus flyers, protest signs, even mainstream news. And the message is always the same. Here is the proof that Israel stole Palestine. Over time, more white, less green, spreading like a virus. Case closed. Except, it's not that simple. These maps flatten one of the most complicated conflicts on Earth into a before and after real estate scam. They skip the peace offers, the treaties, the internal politics, and the basic fact that Palestine meant very different things at different times. But the real problem is deeper. The maps rewrite history by shifting definitions, mislabeling entire regions, and using visual tricks to push a false narrative. So the real question isn't just, are these maps accurate? It's, what are these maps actually showing, and what crucial history are they erasing? Because once you zoom out, you start to see that the story these maps tell isn't the real story at all. At first glance, the first map shows something very simple, that almost all of the land was Palestinian, with just a few tiny white pockets where Jews lived. But the map isn't showing you what you think it's showing you. The white areas are where Jews lived, but the green areas aren't where Arabs lived. The green just shows everything else, everywhere Jews didn't live. That includes huge areas of empty desert and uninhabited hillsides. In other words, the map quietly takes all land that isn't Jewish and labels it Palestinian, which is a massive illogical leap. It's like a hot dog either has ketchup or it doesn't. But it would be ridiculous to assume that any hot dog that doesn't have ketchup must have mustard. This map is making that exact mistake. If the land isn't Jewish, it must be Palestinian. So what should this map really look like? It depends. If we're talking about sovereignty, then in 1947, it doesn't make sense to call any of this Jewish land or Palestinian land. It was all British Mandate territory administered by the British Empire. And before that, it was ruled by the Ottoman Empire for centuries. Yes, the British called this area Palestine, but that's obviously very different from calling it Palestinian territory as we understand it today. In 1947, there were around 630,000 Jews and 1.18 million Muslims living in British Mandate Palestine under British rule. None of this area was actually ruled by Jews or Arabs. Self-determination was still a dream for both peoples. That's if we're talking about sovereignty. But what if we're talking about the actual populations? Who lived where? Jews did own land in areas that roughly correspond to the white areas on map number 1. But that doesn't mean that the rest was owned by Arabs. In 1945, more than 40% of the land was unowned and uncultivated. If you take all of this uninhabited land and call it Palestinian territory, that's just as misleading as if you label it Jewish territory. Because again, just because a hot dog doesn't have ketchup, doesn't mean it's got mustard. So here's the original meme. And here's what it looks like if it shows the actual sovereignty. Once you see the real picture, the entire foundation of the meme starts to crack. But map number 2 is where the whole thing really crumbles. This is a map of something that never actually existed. It was just a proposal, the United Nations attempt to create 2 new states out of the British Mandate, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem as an internationally governed city. And these borders weren't just random slicing. The UN Special Committee on Palestine studied demographics, land ownership, and existing Jewish and Arab population clusters. This was a diplomatic attempt to create 2 new states, not divide an existing one. And here's the part the meme leaves out. Most Jewish leaders accepted the plan, while most Arab leaders weren't so thrilled, and war broke out almost immediately. That's why this map never became a reality. It's not stage 2 of a shrinking Palestine timeline, it's stage 0 of an attempted 2-state solution that failed before it even began. So let's update map number 2. If we're talking about private land ownership, there's no difference between map number 1 and map number 2, and the comparison is pointless. But if we're showing sovereignty, something important happens here. After some quite heated debate, Jewish leaders accepted the partition plan and established the State of Israel. So the moment the British Mandate ended at the stroke of midnight on May 15, 1948, all of this land became the sovereign land of the newly formed State of Israel. But most Palestinian leaders rejected the plan and didn't declare a state of their own. So these areas didn't become a Palestinian state. But they were also no longer part of British territory. So technically this became unallocated territory with no sovereign authority, and Arab armies from surrounding countries moved in as war broke out. Most of the world didn't expect Israel to survive against 5 of its neighbors. Israel lost 1% of its entire population defending itself. But in the end, it surprised everyone and 1. When the fighting stopped in 1949 and the armistice lines were drawn, Israel controlled the entire white part of map number 3. But what about the green part? The meme labels it Palestinian land. But at the end of the fighting, it wasn't under Palestinian control at all. This area was controlled by Jordan, and this area was controlled by Egypt. For 18 years, these territories were controlled by Jordan and Egypt, and neither country handed control over to Palestinian leaders. Neither created a Palestinian state. In the West Bank, Jordan annexed the territory outright in 1950, something almost no country in the world recognized. They granted the local Arabs Jordanian citizenship, only to strip it away decades later. They destroyed dozens of synagogues and expelled the Jewish communities, some of which had been there for centuries. Meanwhile, Egypt actually did establish a symbolic Palestinian government in Gaza, but it had no real sovereign power. The territory remained under Egyptian military rule. So for the entire period shown in map number 3, there was no Palestinian sovereignty. Calling the green area Palestinian land isn't just wrong, it's a flat-out lie. The areas on this map were controlled by Israel, Jordan, and Egypt. Now before we get to map number 4, we have a curious mystery to solve. Why does this meme have a giant gap from 1967 to 2005? That's not a mistake. See, 1967 was the year of the Six-Day War between Israel on one side and Egypt, Jordan, and Syria on the other. When the fighting ended, Israel had taken control of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. In other words, the map changed again, dramatically. But here's the part the meme doesn't want you to know. Right after the war, Israel offered to return almost all of the newly captured land in exchange for peace. That offer was rejected at the Arab League summit, known for the infamous 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, no recognition of Israel. So the map stayed this way until 1978, when Israel and Egypt signed the Camp David Accords, and Israel gave back the entire Sinai Peninsula in exchange for peace. Then in the 1990s came the Oslo Accords, the first real agreement between Israel and the Palestinians themselves. Under the Accords, Israel transferred control of certain parts of the West Bank and Gaza to the newly created Palestinian Authority. And this is where the most important map change of all happens, because for the first time in modern history, Palestinians were given actual self-governing authority, something the meme's shrinking storyline completely buries. And then in 2005, Israel went even further. Israel uprooted every Israeli civilian and withdrew every Israeli soldier from Gaza, giving the Palestinian Authority full control of the territory, resulting in map number 4. See, there's a reason map number 4 doesn't start until 2005. So the meme could skip over all of this. The period from 1967 to 2005 paints a very different picture, not of a shrinking Palestine, but a shrinking Israel, and the birth of Palestinian sovereignty. The green areas of this map aren't random. They're the result of carefully negotiated agreements between Israeli and Palestinian leaders, and both sides agreed these borders were supposed to be temporary, part of a staged process meant to lead to a final peace deal. But this map suffers from another problem. Remember how map number 1 treated every area where Jews didn't live as Palestinian land? Well, map number 4 does the same thing in reverse. It assumes that every area Palestinians don't control is Israel, but huge white sections of the West Bank aren't Israeli neighborhoods, towns, or settlements. They're uninhabited hills, desert, rocky areas, nature reserves, and security zones that both sides agreed would remain under Israeli administration temporarily while final status negotiations continued. These aren't meant to be permanent borders. The land wasn't annexed into Israel. They're disputed areas, and under every serious peace proposal, most of this white land is expected to become part of a future Palestinian state. So if this map was supposed to be temporary, why haven't these little green patches grown in the decades that followed? Well, both sides had to contend with segments of their populations that were extremely skeptical of peace. People who believed that there can never be 2 states living peacefully side by side. On the Israeli side, a certain segment of the population insisted that this territory should remain under Israeli control, and Israel allowed areas of the West Bank to be developed by Israeli settlers establishing new communities. That's a controversial part of the ongoing conflict, and something that would have to be resolved in any final negotiated peace agreement. On the Palestinian side, various factional militias gained power and terror attacks against Israeli civilians surged. The actions pushed by the more extreme factions of each side only seemed to confirm the other side's worst fears. Then came 2007, when everything changed again. The year before, Hamas won Palestinian parliamentary elections. Tensions skyrocketed between Hamas and Fatah, which was the other dominant party in the Palestinian Authority. A year later, Hamas launched a coup in Gaza, throwing Fatah members off rooftops, dragging police chiefs through the streets, executing rivals, and seizing total control of the Strip. From that moment on, Gaza was no longer governed by the Palestinian Authority. It came under the rule of Hamas, an openly extremist organization committed in its founding charter to Israel's destruction, a group that has repeatedly targeted civilians, crushed dissent, and ruthlessly punished Palestinians who oppose them. If we're trying to show an honest map of the region after 2007, Gaza really shouldn't be the same color as the West Bank. It's not part of a unified Palestinian government at all. It's controlled by an armed Islamist faction that seized control by force, oppresses its own people, and has ruled without elections ever since. Which means the real map, at least until October 7th, 2023 and the war that followed, should actually look like this. Israel in one color, PA-administered areas of the West Bank in another, parts of the West Bank temporarily under Israeli control pending a final status agreement in another, and Hamas-controlled Gaza in its own color. But the original meme doesn't show 4 colors. It only shows 2, and that brings us to the last major flaw. Across all 4 maps, the meme uses the same shade of green to imply a single continuous category. But the meaning of green changes every single time. In map number 1, green is everywhere Jews didn't live, including empty desert. In map number 2, green is a proposed Arab state that was never established. In map number 3, green is land controlled by Jordan and Egypt, not Palestinians. And in map number 4, green finally shows areas actually controlled by Palestinians. 4 completely different concepts, packaged to look like one smooth, linear story. That's a textbook logical fallacy known as false equivalence. The meme uses the color green the way a magician uses a deck of cards, distracting you from the fact that what you're looking at keeps changing, even though it all appears to be the same. So let's line up the real maps, the ones that accurately reflect sovereignty in the region. 1947. The entire area is under British control. No sovereign Israel, no sovereign Palestinian state. 1949 to 1967. Gaza is controlled by Egypt, the West Bank is controlled by Jordan. Still no sovereign Palestinian state. 1967. Israel captures more territory during the Six-Day War. 1978. Israel gives the Sinai back to Egypt. In the 90s, after the Oslo Accords, we have Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and areas temporarily controlled by Israel until there can be a final negotiated peace. 2005. Israel completely withdraws from Gaza. 2007. Hamas seizes control of Gaza. Side by side, the real sequence looks nothing like the meme, because the meme isn't designed to inform. It's designed to tell a simple emotional story, one where Palestinian land only ever shrinks and Jewish presence only ever grows. And look, there is something that rings true about this shrinking Palestine meme. Over the past century, Palestinians have had less and less access to the region as a place where their culture and identity can thrive as the majority. That powerful majority position in the region changed when the Jewish minority of this land teamed up with diaspora Jews to establish a nation-state of their own to protect and celebrate Jewish culture and identity. But without a similar Palestinian state, the ability to protect and celebrate Palestinian culture has been squeezed, decade after decade. And we can debate the reasons why a Palestinian state was never established. But I don't want to dismiss the reality that for many Palestinians, this meme captures the feeling that their aspirations for self-determination are shrinking. The truth is, both Israelis and Palestinians have legitimate ties to this land, and both have the right to self-determination. The shrinking Palestine meme misrepresents history and erases context. Like most propaganda, it deepens divisions and stirs conflict, which doesn't help anyone get closer to peace. A more honest and more hopeful approach is to acknowledge both people's stories and to understand that the only path forward is one built on mutual recognition, not misleading memes.